In the previous video, we talked about what would happen in a market if the government implemented a tax on consumers or on producers. And we said that it doesn't matter which they choose. What matters is the elasticity. So one of the main takeaways is that government would not want to tax a market with perfectly inelastic demand or supply unless they were willing to see the group with the inelastic demand or supply bear the entire burden of the tax. Right, so we still haven't fully answered the question of when we might want to tax demand or supply, or what, we sort of said that the government doesn't want to intervene in a market where surplus is maximized, but we might have what we call market failures where surplus is actually not maximized in the competitive market. So one example of this is what we call a positive or demand side externality. And that occurs when there are benefits in a market which do not accrue to those consuming or supplying in the market. So, for example, there's evidence that improved education in an area improves labor market outcomes and decreases crime in a community. And if that were true, the benefits of decreased crime would be felt even by those who did not go to the school. Right, so we refer to the market demand curve without the externality as the marginal private benefits. Without considering the benefits to other people of education, people consider only their own private benefits to education. And then the added benefits of the positive externality create what we call a marginal social benefits curve, which is higher or shifted right. Right, so without market intervention, consumers would consider only the private benefits of consumption, and they would weigh that to the marginal costs. We could assume where marginal cost equals marginal private benefit, which is point A. All right, what we're saying here is that we would actually like more of this good produced and sold on the market. If consumers were considering the benefits at large to everybody in the community of education, then they would choose a higher quantity, which is B. And so here we actually have a case where the market equilibrium is lower than what we call the socially optimal equilibrium. And so there's an area of deadweight loss created if we don't have market intervention. So again, without government intervention, we arrive at point A, and point A is not socially optimal because it doesn't take into account the social benefits of, in this case, higher education. We should have more education. Right, so how could the government intervene in this market to ensure that we get to B here instead of A? What the government could do is provide an inverse tax or a subsidy where the government is actually giving money to people who participate in the school, maybe to the teachers or to the students, one way or another. All right, so what would that do? It would move this marginal private benefits curve. Now you're getting the private benefit plus the subsidy. And if the government knows the amount of that difference, it can subsidize exactly that amount so that we move the marginal private benefit curve plus subsidy to be exactly equal to the marginal social benefits. Okay, so then in this case, we've got, here's our new price. Here's our new quantity. There's some cost to the government, which is this amount of the subsidy or reverse tax. And we see the price that the producers receive here is actually higher than the price consumers pay by the amount of the tax, the subsidy, the inverse tax. All right, so this is one example of where the government might want to intervene in markets. Here, we're not getting enough schools, perhaps, in a particular community, or not a good enough quality of schools. So the government could intervene and make it so that the benefits of going to school are higher. In this case, I guess it's on the demand side. So we would have to say that the private benefits of going to school are not high enough, so the government subsidizes to make the private benefits of going to school higher. Right, that subsidy shifts the private benefit curve by the amount of the subsidy, and we end up at the optimum. We could have a negative or supply side externality when there are extra social costs of production which do not accrue to the producer of the goods. So for example, if you have a chemical plant whose waste products pollute groundwater, this could be an additional cost to the local citizens who are not producing the product which causes pollution. Right, so we refer in this case to the supply curve without the externality as the marginal private costs. And then we have some additional social costs from production, which in this case are polluting the groundwater. So without market intervention, we get supply equals demand. Producers consider only the private costs of production. We wind up at point A, but that has more pollution than we would like, and we would like to get to point B. B is the social optimum, where the marginal social costs equal demand. So in this case, if we're at the competitive solution point A, deadweight loss is created because we have a higher than optimal quantity in the market. We have A, but we would like to only have B. Right. So in this case, it's sort of like at equilibrium, we have these consumers consuming, but it would be optimal for them not to be consuming, because doing so and producing these units creates more pollution. So how could the government intervene in this case to make sure that the socially optimal quantity is provided? You can tax the amount of the negative externality so that the suppliers are forced to internalize that extra cost. Right? The marginal private cost becomes equal to the marginal social cost. Marginal private cost minus tax equals marginal social cost. So we're shifting the marginal private costs up to here. Then we get this market quantity. Right? Consumers pay this price, but producers only get this original price that they were willing to supply this quantity at. And the difference is the tax. So after the tax, the socially optimal quantity is provided, deadweight loss is eliminated. And in both cases here, there's potential measurement issues. In order for this to work, the government has to know exactly the amount of the externality so that it can tax or subsidize that particular amount. One upside to this is, especially in the tax case, if you're collecting tax off of a negative externality producer, you might be able to redistribute that tax in some welfare improving way. And again, we have this sort of like ethical question, which pops up mostly in other classes, which is, are we willing to tax the producer, which is going to, here the producer is receiving a lower price, selling a lower quantity, so that's less total revenue. Are we willing to agree to that in exchange for, say, these social benefits of reducing pollution? All right, so we got these ethical issues, ethical questions which pop up and aren't generally addressed in the main literature, but I think it's good to consider those as we go. So finally, in competitive markets, another policy option would be command policies, which are quotas or price control. So instead of a tax or subsidy, the government can come in and say, all right, no more than a certain quantity or a certain price will be created or charged. So a quota is basically a quantity restriction, or they set a certain quantity. So again, suppose we've got some sort of negative externality here. We would rather be at point B at the marginal social cost curve. Government could say, all right, no more than that quantity will be sold on the market. And as long as the government has some way of enforcing this, then this will be the quantity sold on the market. There will be a price increase, and we can see that this is actually kind of good for consumers, for producers, as long as this area of producer surplus gained is more than this triangle that they lost, producer surplus has increased. Alternatively, there could be price control where, all right, we want this quantity sold on the market. So the government says, producers, you're not allowed to charge more than this price. And at this price, producers are not willing to sell more than this quantity. This is actually bad for producers because we can see they definitely lost some surplus compared to what they had in the competitive market. Right, but once again, we wind up with the socially optimal quantity, less pollution. And both of these policy tools have potential positives and drawbacks. Producers in general are going to spend a lot of money fighting this type of system because they don't want their price to be restricted. But in general, there could also be some surplus lost in this quota system too. So we have to consider positives and negatives. We might need to consider in a particular market, if we intervene, who can afford the greater losses? Is it producers or consumers? And that might again depend on relative elasticities.